He left.
There you are, Sven.
Sven.
The sound is off.
Okay.
We are online.
We are online. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fourth episode of our online debate series, Until Debt Tear Us Apart, on international cooperation and socio-economic justice in the MENA region, which is co-organised by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and by the German Development Institute. My name is Mark Furness. I'm a researcher at the German Development Institute working on international cooperation and the MENA region. And I'm co-moderating the session this afternoon with my colleague, Thomas Claes, who's Project Director, Economic Policies for Social Justice at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Tunis. Before I go any further, I'm just going to hand over to Dalia, who will give you some advice on how to access the Arabic translation. So Dalia, please.
مرحبا جميعا. لو سمحتوا اللي بحب يسمع السيشن باللغة العربية نروح على الانتربريتيشن بالتول بار الموجود بآخر السيشن، نكبسه في عنا إنجليزي أو عربي. اللي بحب يضلوا على اللغة الإنجليزية يضلوا على الإنجليزي، يعمل تشيك على الإنجليزي. برضو من عند الكرة الأرضية الموجودة بالتول بار اللي بحب يسمع بالعربي يختار الأوبشن العربي، وبهيك رح يقدر يسمع الترجمة بالعربي. في حالة أي حدا عنده مشاركة لو سمحتوا تحطوها بالكيو اند اي الموجود بالتول بار برضه لحتى تقدروا تشاركوا، أو اللي بحب يحكي ممكن يعمل ريز هاند. شكراً. سوري، كمان نقطة تانية. بالنسبة لأي حدا شابك من موبايله في 3 نقاط موجودة بالموبايل آخر السكرين. بنكبس ال3 نقاط، بنروح على الانتربريتيشن، بنختار اللغة الفرنسية عشان نسمع بالعربي واللغة الإنجليزية عشان نسمع بالإنجليزي، وبنعمل دن. ضروري نعمل دن. وبرضه نفس الإشي بالسكرين اللي أي حدا شابك من لابتوبه بالتول بار الفرنسي عشان نسمع العربي والإنجليزي عشان تقدر تسمع بالإنجليزي. شكراً.
Thanks very much, Dalia. So this is the fourth episode of our online debate series. The original idea was to combine the expertise and the resources of our two organizations and actually organize a policy workshop and a public meeting in Berlin on international cooperation and social justice in the MENA. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, and with that, both the technical requirement that we move the debates online, as well as the substantive question of what the pandemic means for social justice, and particularly for the economic and political reforms that advocates of social justice in the MENA have been calling for, and what this all means for international development cooperation, or what development cooperation can do to support that. Our first session 3 weeks ago focused on the engagement of international financial institutions in the region. The second session then focused on social contracts and international cooperation, particularly focusing on the World Bank and on Germany. The third session last week focused on protest movements and social justice amid the COVID pandemic. And today we will turn to the European Union. If you didn't take part in the first 3 sessions, if you're interested, you can watch them on YouTube and on Facebook. Hopefully somebody will post a link in the chat, which we've done the last couple of weeks, so that you can click on that link and watch those. So with regard to today's session, just by way of introduction, the slightly provocative title, I suppose you would call it, about learning from the past, is not so much a warning as an expression of, I suppose, frustrated Euro-MENA-philia, which I think is a common emotion among people who've been following European engagement with the Middle East and North Africa for a long time, but have nevertheless not given up their hope that the European Union and its member states will someday develop a coherent, progressive approach that will make a real difference to the people of the region. This is, of course, it's a Eurocentric view, and it may be that for many people in the MENA region, it would be preferable if the EU would stop trying to make a difference. But nevertheless, if the COVID-19 crisis tells us one thing, it tells us that we are interdependent, that we do need each other, and that we should all try hard to learn not only from the mistakes of the past, but also from the positive influences that we've had on each other. Against this background, the overarching question that I hope we'll address directly or indirectly today is, does the COVID-19 pandemic provide Europe and Middle Eastern countries with an opportunity to reset their relations? Most of the academic and policy literature on MENA-EU relations that's been written in the past 30 years or so concurs on the point that the EU talks very well about values and rights in the region, but when it comes to action, however, the EU has continued to focus on political and economic stability and on its own security, and that it supported authoritarian governments rather than risking supporting change in the direction of the very values that it talks so nicely about, such as democratic governance and social justice for ordinary people. Arguably, there was a pretty big opportunity for Europe to change tack and support these values 10 years ago after the Arab uprisings in early 2011. And we're going to talk today about whether the COVID-19 crisis offers another opportunity for this. And I think Thomas will introduce us to a small poll on this question. Thomas, over to you.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Mark, for this introduction, and also from my side and in the name of FES. Hello to everybody joining us today for our fourth and hopefully not last, but at least for this this little series last online debate. We thought, as in the last session, we would do a little poll to assess a bit the feelings in the audience. Maybe Dalia, can you launch the poll right now? We will. The main question is, of course, if the COVID-19 pandemic provides the EU and MENA countries with an opportunity to work together on social justice. And we have three answers for you. The yes, of course, it is obvious that we must work closer together. Then a maybe, there's willingness for partners on both sides, but of course, the current and old structures are not easy to change. And the last option is that it will make everybody more risk averse and everybody will build their own little castle to sit on and wait out the storm. So let's see. You can start answering those questions while I hand back to Mark.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Yeah, we'll ask that question again at the end of the debate. So we'll see whether or not the discussion today changes your views on that. Today we have two speakers to introduce. We were supposed to have three, but unfortunately Ibrahim Saif is not able to join us for personal reasons. We only found out about this just before the session. We still have two speakers. I think we can still have a really good debate with Dania and with Sven. Firstly, Dania is a Middle East specialist with a focus on Arab relations with the West. She has a PhD in politics from the University of Exeter in the UK, and her research interests cover the Syrian crisis, governance, radicalization or fighting radicalization, and peace building. She's published books with Routledge on the Arab lobby in the US and on Western perceptions of the Arab Gulf states. And she's only just published a new edited volume on the effects of the Syrian crisis on regional and international relations. She's an affiliated scholar at the Issam Fares Institute at the American University of Beirut, and is a weekly contributor at Arab News. And she writes a very interesting column at Arab News if you haven't seen it. She is also the co-founder of the Research Center for Cooperation and Peace Building, or the RCCP, which is a Lebanese NGO focused on Track 2 and civil society capacity building. So Dania, we're very, very happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Thomas, for inviting me. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you. Thank you.
Very good. Our second speaker is Sven Kuhn von Bergsdorff. Perhaps Sven, you could turn on your camera at the moment. I see a large S on my screen. Sven also has a PhD in political science from Freiburg University in Germany. And he's also a graduate of the German Development Institute, where I work's postgraduate course. He joined the European Commission's External Service in 1992, and he's since held many posts around the world and in Brussels. He's headed the Commission Directorate General for Development's units for economic governance and for policy coherence. In that role was where I first met Sven a few years back. And he was head of the European Union Commission delegation in Cuba. And since 2012, he was EU ambassador to South Sudan and to Mozambique. And in January this year, he was appointed EU ambassador to the Palestinian territories. So Sven, we're also very, very happy that you accepted our invitation and that we have you with us today.
Pleasure is all mine, Mark, and great to see you again.
Great to see you too. Very good. So turning to our panelists then, Dania, if we may start with you. What international support do Middle Eastern countries really need for coping with and recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic? And what could and should the European Union provide in this regard?
Well, listen, to start with, the COVID-19 did not create problems in the region. It just aggravated them. The problems of corruption, of unemployment, they've always been there, but they're just more aggravated. And the COVID-19, we've had two folds of problems. I mean, you had first the health fold, which people falling sick out of contracting the virus. And then you have the economic repercussion with people not being able to provide for their families. And don't forget, the Middle East region is mainly countries where you don't have social safety net. These countries don't provide social safety net. So the taxi drivers who works the day he doesn't work, he can't provide for his family. So what can EU do? What can European Union as an institution do? And what should it do? First, we should not expect too much. Why am I saying this? Because Europe itself is facing a crisis, economic crisis. They just put $540 billion as a recovery. Nevertheless, they have to help, and they have to help on these two folds. Then, first of all, when we talk about health, there are also two parts. There is first to help with protection from the spread, to protect, which is giving masks, giving sanitizer, and the other side, which is these countries don't have hospitalization capacity. But then again, this brings us back to the problem of corruption. Should they provide aid to these governments? And I think we'll talk about it a lot during the session, about the corruption and how can the EU help people despite the corruption. I mean, if you look at the Lebanon post-blast, I mean, you see on the social media the picture of the masks who've been sold in supermarket, the first aid kit that were offered, by Turkey were sold in the supermarket. The masks that were offered by Kuwait also sold in pharmacies. So how can they help? First, they have to help directly and engage with local NGOs and civil society groups, and they can engage directly with the hospitals. For the economic help, they need to help economically, because most of these people who are now without a job don't have any safety net, social safety net. They have nothing. The government doesn't provide. So here, the European Union can offer food, can offer the food parcels that they usually do when there is a crisis. But also, having said that, delivery is not very easy, for this type of aid. If you take for example, in Syria, if you go to the regime area, it's impossible to help people unless you go through the government, and the government takes sometimes like 90% of the aid. And you have areas where there is fighting going on, like in Yemen. So it's not very easy when we say, how can the EU help in the time of the crisis? And I'm not saying in the long run, I'm saying now. How can you, like when we are in a crisis management mode, what can the EU help? So they can help in these two areas. But again, how much they can help, they can help, but we cannot expect them to alleviate all all the repercussion, all the effect of COVID. It's going to be difficult for the region, yeah, because we already have a difficult time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dania. Just before I move on to Sven, actually, what I didn't mention before was that we will, after the inputs from our participants, we'll open the debate up for inputs and questions and comments from all of the participants. So if you have a question that you want to answer, if you want to join the debate in the second part of it, please put your question in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen rather than in the chat. If you have anything general, please put it in the chat. Put your question in the Q&A. And if somebody already asks the question that you wanted to ask before you ask it, just put an upvote next to it so that we know that there's a few people that are burning to ask this particular question. And then in the second half, Thomas will then unmute the participants and let people in. Good. So Sven, Dania has mentioned that it's very, very difficult for the European Union to assist in the region. I mean, you've been EU ambassador, obviously, in other challenging contexts. It's difficult to think of anywhere more challenging than South Sudan at the end of 2013 when the war started there. Your arrival in Palestine, of course, was timed rather well just before the pandemic hit. And Palestine, of course, is in a very difficult and unique position in that it's fully sovereign. It doesn't control its own borders. So how are the Palestinians coping with the pandemic, and what is the EU doing to assist them?
Yes, well, thanks, Mark, for the questions. And contrary to Dania, and salutes to the other side of our neighboring country, I'm not a specialist on the Middle East, nor have I served beforehand in the Middle East. Basically, my background is very much political development cooperation and peace mediation and conflict resolution, notably on my two last ambassadorial assignments in South Sudan and Mozambique. This was tested. So I'm not sure it was a good omen for me to come to the occupied Palestinian territories, but maybe there is some hope that some of this can be brought to fruition. Now, what we see here, and I would rather use the Palestine example as a case sui generis in order to address some of the issues you're discussing here. The EU, as you probably know, is the most important donor in the occupied territories and has an important also political role to play, which I think we need to discuss as well in order to address the issue of what the EU can do in addition and beyond development cooperation and humanitarian aid. Now, the pandemic exacerbated a looming economic crisis which started a few years ago. And so basically it added to the fiscal burden the PA, the Palestinian Authority, had to face during 2019, when it already had lost control of a good part of its revenues, which were collected in Israel. And then basically the PA refused to receive them for 7 or 8 months because of deductions, because of prisoners' payment. So they came out of this one in November 2019, and boom, March 2020, and pandemic hit. And the problem was you had a very fragile economic environment here, which was exacerbated by two main things, which is basically very unique for the entire Middle East. It is not just the pandemic, it is also the US policy towards the country, exacerbated by the response of the Israeli government to it, namely the Trump plan, the so-called deal of the century, which led to a large degree of disappointment, frustration, and alienation in the wider Palestinian public and in the region at large towards how to deal with that. So you had a combination of a political and an economic crisis. And it didn't help that on May 2020, President Abbas declared of not continuing the coordination with the Israeli authorities any longer, including receiving, accepting the clearance revenues, which represent 65% of the monthly fiscal budget of the authorities of the PA. In other words, a highly aid-dependent and highly tax collection dependent country, which has hardly any revenues, basically cut off its stream of funds by taking a principled position on, unless you declare annexation, which at that time was part of the coalition government agreement between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz and Ashkenazi, declared off the table, we will not resume coordination, because since 1994, the Oslo agreements, we basically having looked that we have to accept that before our eyes, a de facto process of annexation has taken place, which led to settlements, illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem of some 700,000 people. In other words, we basically, under the Oslo Agreement framework, which was the only bilaterally signed agreement between Palestine, or the PLO in that capacity, and the Israeli authorities, under this agreement, a de facto annexation process has taken root and expanded to the extent that they said, Khalas, enough is enough. Now we have to put a blocker, and we're not going to resume until we find a different solution. And that, of course, against the backdrop of the Trump administration, which completely changed US policy since 2018 with the recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, and with the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, in contravention of all previous agreements signed by the previous administration and international law. So this basically was the backdrop against which I took up my office: Trump plan, annexation threat, and pandemic. And you can imagine, you can't imagine a more explosive cocktail in a country which, as you rightly said, doesn't control its own borders, lives since 1967 under occupation, is hit by a split between East Jerusalem, which is considered by the Israelis as part of Israel, the West Bank, which it controls to a certain extent in limited areas, Area A namely, and the Gaza, which since 2007, after the split between Fatah and Hamas, is being run by what we call the de facto authorities, namely Hamas. So this is the backdrop against which the governments in the areas concerned had to face off the pandemic. It's a very difficult situation for us in Jerusalem. I'm based in Jerusalem, but of course I'm dealing every day with colleagues and partners in Ramallah, and to the extent possible Gaza as well, but I haven't been in Gaza since the 5th of March because of the pandemic and the restrictions imposed by Hamas for health reasons. So that is the background. What is the situation now in the Palestinian population? As you can imagine, because of the looming crisis of the past few years, exacerbated by 2020, the halt of coordination, we can see that there will be a drop in real GDP of anything between 12 to 15% at the end of this year. And I will not bore you with macroeconomic figures, but if you add to it a fiscal deficit, which is also ballooning, and a current accounts deficit in the high 30s, you know, you had all the problems any country could face, but Palestine doesn't have the monetary and fiscal tools to address it. They cannot, contrary to most other countries, use the central bank, which they don't control, they don't have it, to inject, for instance, much needed liquidity into the economy. They basically have to go back to the commercial banks in order to defer you know, any kind of payments individual enterprises will have to honor. They will have to help the Palestinian authorities for bridging loans in order to meet their fiscal obligations, as a result of which, for the past half year or so, the PA was not in a position actually to honor on a regular basis salaries or pensions, etc., which is a key proponent of its strategy to maintain social stability, let alone support the real sector, let alone supporting the enterprises, in particular the SMEs, which is the backbone of the Palestinian economy. So against this backdrop, it's not surprising to see a drop in GDP, a large drop in GDP, a large hit of purchasing power, a pauperization of groups of the population which doesn't have access to employment opportunities. We already had in 2019 unemployment rate of some 26%, which will increase way beyond 30% at the end of the year, with Gaza being particularly hard hit, not just because of the closure, but because also of the lack of opportunities imposed by the closure, both from Egypt, and to be fair, and Israel on both sides. And if you look at Gaza, which is a very explosive cocktail of having 2 million people confined in a very limited space with secure access of energy and water, and not being able to receive inputs because of security concerns from the Israeli side, not being able to export because of restrictions, you know, this is very difficult, as a result of which unemployment is way beyond 40%, and amongst the youth, at least 65% already, and getting even higher. So this is very, very problematic. The PA, which has a limited ability to act upon it, because the PA, actually the government of Palestine, has more authority in the West Bank than much authority in Gaza, where 40% of all Palestinians live, and no authority in East Jerusalem, where about 300,000 Palestinians live, because the Israeli authorities don't allow them to enact or carry out or execute any government functions. So this is a very difficult environment against which we operate. Now, what did we do? And I don't know whether I can already reply to this, what we did. I think the EU was very fast in trying to address this. We mobilized in April 2020, what we call a Team Europe approach. Team Europe, why? Because we wanted to mobilize all actors, not just the EU proper, meaning, you know, in this case, DG NEAR, so enlargement, and MENA, Middle East political guys, but also the financing institutions, notably the EIB and the EBRD, and member states and like-minded partners. So under the Team Europe approach, we also have the UK, which, as you know, will be leaving us. Norway and Switzerland as well signed up to it. And it's an amount of 370 million euros, which tries to address 3 main objectives. And I'm very happy to report to the audience that we are on track of honoring our commitments. A, through front-loading budget support, which I'm happy to also steer here in this country, we basically address the payments of key civil servants in the education and health sector, and pensions, of course, as well. And in order to avoid that we can be accused of, you know, funding implicitly people who have been or are on restrictive lists, the called sort of terror lists, we actually have developed a software whereby we can screen every single recipient against his or her possible appearance on any of the 1,600 sanctions lists. So we can actually control this. Luckily, we use informatic means to do that and not by hand, as in the good old days. So we actually do this. We also have a very important cash transfer scheme in our objective of promoting and ensuring social protection of both populations, vulnerable populations in the West Bank and in Gaza. And we have, last but not least, a budget support mechanism to support the 6 East Jerusalem hospitals, which are purely private, not supported by the Israeli authorities, and 100% dependent on funds from the PA, from ourselves and other partners, notably from the Gulf and some member states. So that's the front loading was important, a lesson we learned in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Whereas, like you made from the EU side, I was even, you know, part of the team of trying to mobilize this response at that time. So some useful lessons from that experience. But in addition, and this is very different to the 2008 and 2009 crisis, this is not eo ipso or prima facie only a fiscal crisis. This is a real economy crisis where the enterprises and the households are hurting, as a result of which we stepped up our engagement to providing subsidized loans, guarantees, etc., to the enterprise sector through local banks, so make them less risk averse and provide them with more assurance that they can continue lending to the enterprises, which are very, very hard hit. And the last aspect, of course, is health. It should be the first, but it was also the first in the addition. Of course, in a situation where the health system in Palestine is undercovered and largely written with lots of problems and underfunded, it was important to redirect funding to our health sector, to other East Jerusalem hospitals, so they can actually deal with COVID cases, protection equipment, ICU units, etc. All this is part of it. It was more complicated, of course, in Gaza because of access restrictions. There we used also ECHO, humanitarian funds, to help them. But I think overall we are on track with our support. As I said, 373 million altogether as the Team Europe, and 155 million from my own institution, the EU proper. And well, that's it. I think that's it. Last but not least, because as a diplomat, I cannot say we're just doing development cooperation. We just engaged also heavily on the political front in terms of trying to address the incompatibility of the Trump plan, the so-called deal of the century, with international law and international parameters. And I think the EU was adamant and completely united in that. And together with Arab neighbors and together with other members of the Quartet, including Russia and others sort of important players, with the great exception of course, of the US, which only wanted to discuss its plan, the Trump plan, we were able actually, together with the principal position of the PA, to face off that threat. But I have to say here, and that's the second challenge we are facing right now, or most notably the Palestinians, as you have seen, the agreements of normalization with Israel and UAE and Bahrain and possibly other Gulf countries are forthcoming. It remains to be seen. That, of course, put the Palestinians under a tremendous political stress. Why? Because the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 from the Saudis made conditional any normalization between Israel and Arab neighbors or the Middle East at large, conditional on accepting an independent, contiguous, viable Palestinian state. Now, not having done this was seen by the Palestinian leadership, both Hamas and Fatah and the others at large, as a betrayal of the very foundation of the Palestinian political objective. So I don't want to go into that but I just wanted to declare the perception. So it's also my task here on the ground of trying to speak to the Palestinian leadership and trying to accommodate their concern that the EU continues to stand fully behind a two-state solution based on the international parameters, including the relevant Security Council resolutions and international law at large. So let me stop here. I'm happy to take, of course, many more questions in the course of the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Sven. Yeah, I mean, rather a lot of activities there. I mean, we will come back to that policy level discussion in a moment. I think at least it's interesting perhaps to see that if the COVID-19 pandemic is not unifying the European approach at the policy level, it seems to be making a bit of a difference at the level of coordination at the very least, which is also an area where obviously there have been challenges for a very long time. Turning back to Dania, Sven's talked a lot about a lot of activities, money, all that kind of thing. I mean, when you look at, I mean, you've been researching relations between MENA countries in the West for many years. You've now started a non-governmental think tank in your home country in Lebanon. And Lebanon, of course, has been hit very hard by the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And of course, there you have the additional tragedy of the port explosion and the challenges of coping with all of these things, which have become even greater. European leaders have, of course, promised greater support for Lebanon. They've pledged to back political reform as well as public sector capacity building. Do you think that the EU is delivering? Where do you think its support is most appreciated by the Lebanese people, and where could it do better?
Well, thank you, Mark, for the question. If you ask anyone, if you now go to the street of Beirut or Trablus, anywhere, and ask them, what would you like the EU or the West to help you with? They will simply tell you, help us get rid of the corrupt political class that's been ruling us for 3 decades. Having said that, the EU cannot change government. You know, they cannot change the Lebanese government. Lebanese people have to change Lebanese government. When we talk about support, I have to say that the EU as an institution, as like, you know, one institution or European country have been offered a lot of support to Lebanon, starting with Paris 1, where I think $500 million was pledged, then Paris 2, which just 4.3 billion were pledged, then Stockholm conference, then the last one was said in 2018, 2 years ago, in April 2010, and they pledged $11 billion, but they were conditional on some reforms. despite the aid that Europeans have given to Lebanon throughout the years, this aid didn't give any real growth. You know, even in cases like, you know, in 2006, after you had the bombing by Israel, there was a lot of money poured into the country. You would have a boom, then we'll go back down again. You know, all the money that's been poured into the economy didn't result in true growth. It only resulted for short-lived booms. Why is that? Because a lot of the money that, and here, I mean, I do blame the Europeans, because they knew all this money was going into the pocket of corrupt politicians, but they accepted that because they thought that, okay, this is the system, this is how the system functions, this is how the tax we have to pay, and so we have to do it to keep the country functioning and to keep the country together. Well, now they realize that these political elites cannot keep the country functioning and cannot keep the country together. And you know, the dysfunction came way before COVID. You know, the dysfunction, the protests that came last October, a year from, I mean, last year, like a year ago, was because the country was no longer functioning and the system could not, wasn't, I mean, this whole setup was no longer sustainable. So as we say that, you know, when Europe or European Union give money to the government, they indirectly reinforce the clientelism, reinforce corruption of the ruling elite, you know, the ruling political elite. Okay, so here we have a dilemma. If the Europe goes through the government, they will be promoting, you know, they will be encouraging corruption. But in order to help the Lebanese people, they need to go to the government. Of course, I mean, as I was talking before about like when you have emergency response, of course you can go through NGO and UN organizations. And yeah, this is when we talk about relief and emergency response. But if you need something like more development, if you need something more like, especially now with the reconstruction after the Beirut blast, there is no other way. You have to go through the government. So here we have this dilemma. We don't want to go through the government, not to encourage them on corruption, but we need to go through the government to help the Lebanese people. So how can we solve this dilemma? What can we do? Well, I suggest, and which will be really very difficult. I mean, it's not an easy thing, is going local. Because, and again, going local, first of all, is if you have a project with, instead of having one project with Ministry, for example, of Education, then you'll have 10 projects and you'll have to deal with 10 actors, which are the local municipality. But then even dealing with the municipalities does not solve the problem, because if you deal with the municipality, there is no guarantee that the person of the municipality is not politically affiliated to these corrupt political figure, and he's clean. Okay, so what you need to bring with the political, with the municipality, you need to bring civil society organization. But again, here you need to vet them, because not all of them are really catered to the grassroots, are engaging with the grassroots and have legitimacy. I mean, I was talking to a colleague from the EU, and he told me following the explosion, there were 800 registration for civil society organization. So are these all legit? Are these all, they have operation, they cater to their communities? So you need here to vetting. Again, even let's say if we vetted the good civil society organization and matched it with the municipality to have like check on them, we have another problem in Lebanon. What is the other problem? The other problem is the political system is very centralized. We don't have decentralization, but we have deconcentration. So even when you have to have approval and official approvals and you need signature, you need to go to the central state, which will not be happy that the money is not coming to her, to the central government. So here but maybe you will not be able to execute the project. So here, to circumvent the political class will still be delivering, and to prevent the political class at the same time be able to deliver the service to the people, I suggest to be partnership between the civil society organization, the municipality, and the civil military cooperation, CIMEC, Civil Military Cooperation Directorate at the Lebanese Armed Forces. And why the LAF? Why the Lebanese Armed Forces? Despite all the criticism that the LAF, the army received, that they've been very harsh and very tough with the protester, the army remains the only institution in Lebanon that still has some sort of legitimacy, that the average Lebanese look at it as a national institution. And from experience, the CIMEC have worked well with local municipalities, and they haven't been any really, at least flagrant cases of corruption. And because they are the army, they can have their leeway, they can push for approvals. So what I'm suggesting, which is not easy at all, because imagine yourself as an official, you work for the EU, instead of giving $100 million, for example, to the Ministry of Education and following up with one person, now what you need to do is, instead of one project, you have 10 projects in Lebanon. And in each project, you need to deal with 3 people and you need to vet them. Yeah. So that's becomes more difficult task. But I think it is a way where you can deliver, it is more secure way to deliver the services to the grassroots. And before they've tried so much with the government and it failed. They failed. They were not able, and all this money didn't amount into real growth and real development. So I think they have to try, because as Einstein says, you cannot keep on doing the same thing and expect different solution, different results. So they have to try this way. So go local, go with the grassroots, and it will be more difficult, but I think it is more secure. It will guarantee a better result if done properly. I'll stop it here.
Yeah, I think that's it's an interesting approach, an interesting proposal. I wonder what Sven would make of it, and what the what external actors would make of it. I guess there's nothing wrong with supporting a military civilian organization like that, particularly if they have this domestic legitimacy. But obviously, with any of these kinds of things, there needs to be safeguards put in place. And of course, at the EU level right now, we have a discussion over the new European Peace Facility and new financing mechanisms for exactly that sort of thing. And they are currently discussing how you introduce safeguards and make sure that these kinds of approaches are transparent. But I think it's certainly an approach which deserves some serious thought. Sven, if we perhaps move beyond the individual Palestinian situation and look at the region more generally, Ursula von der Leyen, of course, came to office last year saying that she wanted the Commission to be more geopolitical. And if you look at the geopolitics of the Middle East region, you have actors like Russia and Turkey, the United Arab Emirates as well, which are not shy about exercising their influence and even using military assets to do that. You have the United States, as you've mentioned, stepping up diplomatic support for Israel in ways that make the Palestinians fear that they'll never see their own state. And also in the EU, at the EU level, you have difficulties with forming common positions on issues like Turkish gas exploration, like how to deal with the Libyan crisis. Given this geopolitical context, which is rather challenging, do you think, firstly, that our poll is right, that the pandemic really does give the EU an opportunity to change its approach? And do you think that there's really appetite, given this geopolitical context, do you think there's really appetite in Europe for the Europeans to step up their support in terms of socio-economic justice for ordinary people in the Middle East region.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Allow me before, I can't resist to try to provide some reflections on what Dania said. And this is more because I have an old development cooperation background. I've been grappling with that dilemma, Dania, for the past 30 years of my professional life. So I can't resist in sharing my own thinking before I come to Mark's question. You have to, according to my view and my experience, of course, is there's a fine line to walk between trying to encourage good governance by providing funds through budget support, for instance, to a government which, at least on the commitment level, on the policy level, signs up or seems to sign up to the same objectives, and controlling the flow of funds to the extent that every single dime or dinar or euro can actually be controlled. And for instance, we in Palestine have engaged for some years now on budget support. It's a quasi-budget support mechanism called PEGASE, but it's very earmarked with strong ex-ante and ex-post controls. I think for me as an economist, far too transactional, far too controlled, because it doesn't provide for the marge de manœuvre of a recipient government to see to it that its priorities in a changing environment can be quickly addressed. But assuming that your partner government or recipient government has a problem in corruption, and if that's the case, then we actually shouldn't provide budget support, which is not very, very clearly and tightly monitored, right? So I would always be against, and so is my institution, against providing budget support unless there are reasonable assurances in place that you do this. On the other hand, saying you just let 100,000 flowers, dictum of Mao Zedong, which was no 1,000 flowers or 100 flowers blossom, in order to, you know, cater for the various needs, for instance, at local level, incurs high transaction costs for the provider of assistance, far too high. I mean, I already have an office of 80 people here, 40 of whom are working day and night on cooperation. Imagine your approach would be transposed into a more general approach. I would need 200, 300, 400 people, right? Just to make sure the monitoring of each and single project is done according to the rules. And that takes away not just our ability to influence policy reform and policy dialogue with the recipient government, it also requires that on the recipient side, they have sufficient absorptive capacity to deal with us on, you know, checking every single dime we provide or don't provide. So the entire aid machine prior to the mid-90s was based on this premise. And since the 90s, when we talked about budget support, it basically shifted under the Paris Agreement and the aid effectiveness agenda. We shifted more to budget support. But of course, the underlying assumption is that basically you have a committed, well-run government having the same objectives as the donor. If these objectives are not met, or if the control mechanisms internally through the normal budget process are not properly in place, we shouldn't do it. So I'm with you on that one. And I fully agree that in order to have effective impact on the ground, sometimes you may go to what we would call public-private partnerships. You added the army connotation here, which I find interesting, but you know, of course, much better the Lebanon situation. I don't give, I think the army automatically a leap of faith when it comes to not being corrupt. As a matter of fact, in conflicts I've seen around the world, in particular in Africa, but also in the Middle East, through the literature I read, it's exactly the war economy which makes it so enticing for the army to actually continue to stay in power there, perpetuate the control of the resources they monopolize there, and through corruption, of course. So this may be different in Lebanon, but I fully agree with you that delivery of assistance at local level through a good cooperation between CSOs or NGOs with the capacity and local authorities, and then other partners, that is certainly a way of addressing certain public services we otherwise are wanting. So I agree with that, of course, but it's a problem, as I said, according to my experience. So on the question of Mark, if I may return to that one, you asked whether it's appetite. The question mark is whether it's appetite. It's an absolute political imperative, a necessity of ensuring that socio-economic justice is a primary concern for EU policy and actions in the Middle East and elsewhere. That's the underlying, I mean, look at the three great priorities. You quoted my Commission President von der Leyen. The new Commission has three great priorities for the next 7 years, which is 5 years, but I'm looking at the financial framework, 7 years. A, green economy, addressing climate change. B, digital economy, ensuring technological change and trying to modernize and make the EU economies fit for purpose. And 3, very important, resilient economies with a view to addressing the increasing inequality between the haves and the have-nots, which is exactly the problem which we have in many of our emerging and developing countries, increasing inequality. And that, if you don't address this issue, of course, you exacerbate existing and prevailing inequalities and lack of distribution and lack of sort of empowering the poor with a view to being able to participate in economic, political, and social decision-making. So from that perspective, I think the policy objectives of the new Commission are fully in line with the concerns and are inspired by the lessons from the Arab Spring, from the failed Arab Spring in most countries, where actually we possibly didn't address this. Now, if you look at the communication which we did in 2015 on the southern neighborhood, which is the one still in place, you look at, I'm just look at it again, just to make sure that I'm not misquoting things here. You've got 3 large sort of priorities: economic development for stabilization, and then we have all this buzzwords: economic modernization, entrepreneurship, employment, employability, focus on youth, partnerships for growth, connectivity, energy security, and climate action, of course. Then you have the second security dimension, classical fight against terrorism, but also security sector reform in many of our partner countries, absolutely necessary. And then, of course, trying to disrupt organized crime and the gangs and the mafias there. But also, of course, making sure that we have a better crisis management response capacity as an EU. And then the large important aspect is migration mobility. And I don't need to go into details. I don't think that these headings are false or misleading or not. I think we need to possibly recalibrate them in terms of our response capacity. What did COVID tell us? COVID tells us what we knew beforehand, that we need to be ready to react much quicker than we have in March or April against pandemic or global threats. And that can be an economic crisis, as we had in 2008, 2009. That can and has to be a health crisis, and it's quite possible that this virus mutate very soon and will, appear again next year or shortly thereafter, or another virus will appear. That has something to do with, of course, the instability in regions, which will lead to further influx of migrants who, for the simple sake of survival or political repression, will seek safe havens. And of course, Europe is the nearest safe haven there. So this is not something we can discard. Demographic pressure in Africa and in the Middle East is such that it will be is the quickest growing continent for decades to come. So we cannot write this off. And also the climate change pressure is such that, combined with demographic pressure and the lack of access to natural resources, water, energy, and land, and the IE at that time wrote an interesting piece of work on our behalf at that time, this together will force us, not just the EU, the global community, to act upon these threats in a preemptive and preparatory and preventive manner. So what does this mean in terms of operational conclusions? I think that the old dictum that it's all about good governance is absolutely right. So ever since I've started working since the late 80s on development cooperation and working in developing countries, I was convinced that it's not money really which makes a difference, it's the development commitment of a given leadership. And the more I work in the various continents I've been assigned to, the more I come to the conclusion it's all about good governance. Of course it helps, as Jeffrey Sachs formulated, that we need billions to inject. But financing has only an impact if there is a recipient government or a society with the capacity to absorb this and make it happen. That's the reason why, as we know, I repeat something which everybody knows, that certain countries in South and East Asia were more successful in using the influx of funds and the ability of redirecting their economies in line with their respective comparative advantages in a globalizing environment more efficiently than other countries. So I think it's a combination of these factors which need to inspire us, but it's clear that good governance, i.e. democratic societies, i.e. social cohesion, together with societies which protect rule of law so that entrepreneurship can develop and finds itself protected against government intervention, together with a trade and investment regime which allows us to have the best access to technology and financing available on the planet for your specific purposes of your economy and in line with your transition phases. That, I think, is very much true. And the fact that EU cannot discard what I would call the southern neighborhood is because we are partners in crime. We will not be affected as badly by crisis there, but we will be affected, as I said. And the globalization threats don't know borders. You see it in a crisis on financial markets, on capital markets. You see it in a health crisis now. It becomes so blatantly obvious. And you see it, of course, in climate change. And these things will continue to dominate our thinking how to make societies and countries and states more resilient. So I don't know to what extent my masters in Brussels will address this in a more different conceptual framework, but I can tell you that in the first quarter of 2021, the Commission, together with the EAS, will formulate a new communication on the southern neighborhood. And I guess they will be largely inspired by these three aspects: green economy, digital economy, and resilient economies. So, and I'm sure this will impact also on our financial allocations for 2021, 2027. A last word maybe on that one. I do expect that financial allocation for the southern neighborhood, including for Palestine, where we actually have on average 300 to 330 million euros a year to spend on behalf and with the Palestinian population, that these allocations will possibly remain the same. I don't think they increase, but they remain the same. So from a monetary or funding perspective, the EU continues to be possibly the strongest donor in the region, and certainly in Palestine. Hopefully, Mr. Biden will enable us to believe that the US will resume also cooperation in Palestine as well. Good, thank you.
Thanks, Sven. Yes, hopes for Joe Biden, but that's a different debate, I think, from the one we're having today. Yeah, I mean, interesting news, I think, on the new communication. And I mean, as you pointed out, you know, the EU's policies have all of the headings there, and it is really a question as to which of those headings they put the most influence or emphasis on. And I think since 2015, perhaps the fear index, if you like, has perhaps dominated thinking more than the cooperation index has, I think, and this will be interesting to see whether the COVID pandemic changes that perspective. Back to you, Dania, just for one final quick question before we open up the floor to the participants. Just on that issue of risk. I mean, Sven, as he pointed out, that working with governments is risky, working with civil society partners is risky as well, and obviously working with a civil military organization has another kinds of risk. I mean, we can't eliminate risk from our lives entirely, of course. Do you think that the EU should be taking, or could and should be taking, greater risks in support of civil society actors, even if governments consider them to be opposition groups? And what do you think the potential payoffs are for Middle Eastern countries, but also for Europe?
Thank you, Mark. Mark, can I, before I answer the question, make 2 comments on what Sven said?
Sure, we're having a debate, Dani, so go for it.
Yeah, first I just want to clarify, because I felt, Sven, like, you know, we don't want the military to take over. You know, Lebanon is a special case. And why am I saying this? I'm saying because PPP, private-public partnership, if with a local municipality, it might not work because it's a centralized form of government. So, you know, the municipality may not be able to get the necessary approval. This is where, if they partner with the civil military, directorate, civil military cooperation directorate, the military will be able to push for them for there. And you know, when you have three partners, the civil society, the municipality, and the CMEC, they will be able to check on each other, you know. So this is a special case for Lebanon. This is a special case for Lebanon. This is, I mean, at the end of the day, we have to be pragmatic. We have to see what can work. And I'm saying this because before there are many projects, like there is a project in Trablus now that I've been following up. It is working okay, it is working well. And it is a partnership between the municipality and the CMEC. So the CMEC have shown results before, and especially when it comes to emergency response, you know, they've been good. So this is specifically for Lebanon. I'm not advocating the army. I mean, I'm not advocating a model of Egypt where the army takes over the private sector. Of course not. That's not what I'm advocating. I'm advocating in the case of Lebanon, where the army is actually subordinate to the political power, to the civilian power. You know, the army, the military power is subordinate to the civilian power, to the civilian authority. In this case, in the case of Lebanon and in the case of CMEC, in this case where we need to go to the local authorities and they don't have much power to push for approval, in this specific case, I'm advocating for this type of partnership. And it's not easy, and I'm saying, but also just giving money and hoping that you know, these corrupt politicians one day will see the light and they will reform will not happen. I mean, these politicians thrive on corruption, not only to enrich themselves, but also to create support for them. I mean, this is how they get their support, by giving perks, by giving the jobs. They will not reform. I mean, why haven't they reformed? I mean, SED have been for 2 years. They haven't reformed. They create an inertia for reforms. Actually, we know what is needed. When we say EU wants to help the public reform of the public sector, we know how to reform, what is needed to reform the public sector. But the problem is the political elite is creating an inertia against any change. I want also to comment a small comment on your previous question about having you know, regional power, having you know, exercising influence in the region. You mentioned the UAE, you mentioned Turkey, you mentioned Iran. Actually, this is a big part of our problems, why we have local conflicts became much worse because of this competition between three axes, which is Saudi. One axis is Saudi UAE, the second axis is Qatar Turkey, the third axis is Iran. And their competition is inflating these local conflicts, you know, whether in Iran, whether in Yemen, whether in Syria, whether in Libya. And here I think the EU can play a role that, you know, initially we didn't have that because the US was much more engaged in the region. So it was a kind of offshore balancer. So it would balance the different forces. No one would dare to step out of line. Now, when you have less engagement, each axe is trying to flex his muscle. Each country, each of these regional power is trying to flex his muscle. I think more EU assertiveness, EU can play the role of an offshore balance, can play the role that the US used to play. And I'll tell you why it is important. You are European and you remember, you know, the 30 Years War. And, you know, the different countries came to, you know, convene for a Congress for the Treaty of Westphalia only when they had no more money and no more young men to fight, you know, when they were drained. And we were far away from that because there is still money and there are still young men to fight. So if we want to leave the equilibrium point to reach to, you know, for us to reach the equilibrium point naturally, that's maybe another 10 years. So yes, if we can have the EU as an offshore balancer that will keep a balance between the different powers, that will be very great, very good. And this will contribute to stability in the region. So again, let's go back to the initial. Sorry, I took long. I make sure that my questions are concise. I don't like to go over time. Regarding the risk, do they have any other option? I mean, tell me. They've been, Europeans have been for years accepting, tolerating mediocrity for the sake of stability. And it's not with the COVID. It was from the Arab Spring when all these dictatorships fell. They realized that this dictatorship didn't provide stability. They provided actually fake stability. They provided stagnation, you know. And now, and all these dictatorship what are doing, and we had a discussion about it, what they are doing, because when you can offer anything, you offer instability. Saad Hariri told Angela Merkel when she came to Beirut, either you give us money or we send you all the refugees in ships. Same, Hafez al-Fattah Sisi had the same attitude with the European. You give us aid, otherwise we'll send you all our young people as immigrants. So it is, besides justice, beside these grand ethical precepts, and it is in the interest of Europe to have a stable neighborhood. Look, the spillover of our problems is greatly affecting Europe. The terrorism led to the surge of extreme right. It's almost going to break up Europe. Europe, the European Union, the project that's been there for 70 years, the project that brought prosperity for a continent that knew in the last century two destructive huge wars. It risks breaking up because of the problem in the neighborhood. You have because of our problem, the spillover was terrorism, increase in terrorism in mainland Europe, immigration, illegal immigration, which had social repercussions and had the rise of the right. So I'm saying it's not about taking risk. It's about they have no other choice. They need to fix the region. They need to have, and they now know for sure that the corrupt systems, let's talk about Lebanon. They will not change by themselves. It's against their own interest to change. They thrive on corruption. And as I said before, it's not only about enriching themselves. It's about, this is how they get, through corruption, they get support. So yes, they need to support the civil society. Again, I'm a pragmatic. It's very good to criticize and analyze, but again, I think in this debate, what is better is to come with solutions, with suggestion. What can be done? How can we have a solution? What is executable? Okay, and how can European Union have civil society organization? Two ways. First of all, by political pressure. See, I will tell you, in Lebanon, for example, the Syrian forces have been in Lebanon for 30 years. They left Lebanon after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, the former prime minister. How this happened, how did Assad forces relinquish on Lebanon? Because you had two factors coming together. One of them was the popular pressure, the pressure from the Lebanese. And the second one, the popular pressure, was coupled with international pressure. Popular pressure by itself is not enough. Look at Lebanon. People have been for 1 year in the protesting. Did anyone lose sleep? Did anyone say, I want to leave? So they should couple, give pressure these government and not be intimidated. Europe has to be more assertive. The US has been quite assertive and they've imposed sanctions. For example, in Lebanon, they've imposed the Magnitsky. So far, they've been going quite slow. They've only sanctioned 2 political figures. We hope more political figures, corrupt politicians, will be sanctioned. I know in Europe it's not that easy to have sanctions because you need unanimity, and it's not one country, it's a group of countries. But Europe should be more assertive and should engage with the civil society, and by exerting political pressure. Also in places where there is some margin of freedom, like Lebanon. they can help in capacity building. Of course, I mean, if you tell me with Egypt, it's impossible. Let's say if your organization or any NGOs goes and say, I want to build capacity for civil society organization in Egypt, that's not possible. That's not possible at all. But in places where there is some margin of freedom, I think that's what they should do. They should, because also the civil society should provide a viable alternative. And how capacity building, and I think it should go, because as Sven has said it in one word that I think resumes our whole debate. The problem is a governance problem. The main problem now in a country like Lebanon is corruption. Tell me about it. COVID is just a marginal problem compared to the corruption we've been living for decades. So the first step is to help them how to locate corruption issues legally in their community. The second is to train them how to build an agenda around an anti-corruption agenda, and how to gather around the critical mass, and how to do the alliances. And the third step is how to raise the salience of the issue, whether in traditional media and in social media. So I think this capacity building on one side, working with the grassroots on one side, and on the other hand, they need to be more assertive with the government and to exert on them political pressure. I'll stop at that.
Thanks very much, Dania. I think there's plenty of food for thought there for the European Union when they revise their policy framework next year. So I just want to turn over now to Thomas. I think we've got a lot of questions that have come in from our participants here, and without any further ado, I'll let you bring them in. And I think there's a fair bit there for both of our speakers.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. And yes, we have gotten a number of very interesting questions, I think. I'll give the participants who I select for the questions the ability to speak, so they can ask their questions by themselves. And I think I'll take packs of 2 for now, because we don't have so much time. And please also post your questions rather brief, because our time is really running a bit short. And also just introduce yourselves quickly when you ask your questions. I give the first question to Ibrahim Natil. Are you ready to speak, Ibrahim?
Hello there. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. The first question was just, stated clearly in the A and the Q regarding, I actually did 4 or 5 questions, but the first one, what are the major challenges facing German organization working in the Palestinian territories or in Palestine? The second question, how the EU can intervene more constructively in the Palestine-Israel conflict rather than financial support. It's more particularly in the current situation facing the Palestinian and Israel, of course, facing all the world. And this, there are, and the third one, how the EU non-international organization, international organization from the EU, how can they work and build equal partnership with Palestinian civil society in the current situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. I think we had another question to Sven, to just connected from Anya. Would you be ready?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, just thank you so much for the presentations and for the organizers, the DIA and the FS organizing these events. To be brief, my name is Anya Sorab. I'm currently working at Bergsdorff University in Palestine. And when you were talking about funds provided to the Palestinian Authority, And as you may know, Palestinian universities, institutions of higher education are struggling a lot since years, and COVID-19, of course, is aggravating the situation. Is there any possibility, or are there any funds the European Union and the member countries are able to provide the universities with some kind of additional support in these times of crisis? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anya. Sven, if you don't mind, I'll take another question that is addressed to you and then give you the floor. We had a quick question, I think, from Nermin. Would you be so kind, Nermin?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, because you talked at some point about 1,600 list of sanctions that were some NGOs or like Palestinian individuals were put on in order not to forward those funds to. And I was wondering how were these lists made, who forwarded to you? Because like I would have suspicion, for example, if it was forwarded by Israeli authorities, then obviously some funds won't go where they're supposed to go. Thank you so much for your answers in advance.
Thank you very much, Nermin. Then please, Sven.
Yes, thank you very much. I could have opted for answering privately, but I'd like to take the bullet standing tall here. So now these questions are relevant, of course. So how can we move more constructively towards the resolution of the Israeli-Palestine conflict? Well, it's just 70 years of conflict. So some say 3,000 years of conflict. So can we solve it? No, but it's true. It's entirely true that, and I would agree also with what Danya said. The EU needs to be more assertive in the Middle East. I'd say across the globe. I'd say we need to put deeds behind our words. If we are supposed to be a serious foreign policy player, including on the security defense front, we need to actually work this. Now, as you know, during the past few years, I'd say the past 3 years, following the decision of our British friends to leave, we were able to move enormously on cooperation amongst and around security and defense cooperation. 24 of projects have been launched where there was no objection anymore from one given member state. So there's a recognition that the EU needs to be much stronger when it comes to basically also exerting and projecting hard power, and not just seeing sort of be seen as the nice guy recalling the importance of international human rights law and international law in general, but basically not putting much weight behind that, except for, of course, then certain sanctions where we feel confident that this doesn't harm unity. There is a serious discussion ongoing within the EU orbit of making us more effective, and this discussion takes also place in the missions where we are. So I fully agree with the objective. Now, with respect to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it's entirely legitimate to say that we need also to be more assertive when it comes to the Israeli friends and partners. And it takes two to tango. We cannot just try to help sustain a state-building project in Palestine, which for the past 25 years since Oslo has to be undermined by the reality on the ground, with settlement expansion blossoming throughout the West Bank and not taking necessary corrective action on the Israeli side. I think this is an important statement which we have to, criticism which we have to face and be ready to answer it. It was, of course, difficult in the past few years, the past 4 years to be precise, under the Trump administration, for the EU to take a very robust approach on that matter, simply for the reason that the established mechanism for facilitating the dialogue between Israel and Palestine is the Quartet. And the Quartet is based on anonymity, it's based on consensus. And if one party says, it's my deal or no deal, it's my way or the highway, and that was exactly what the Trump administration said once they presented the deal of the century, it is very difficult for the remaining parties, meaning the EU, UN, and Russia, to say, let's move forward on the Quartet. That's the reason why many people hope that a different occupant in the White House might provide for a more conducive environment. And also this changing landscape in the US political landscape, where you have more progressive wings being more assertive, even within and around the nominee on the Democratic side. There's a hope that the environment for re-engaging politically towards a credible two-state solution, and that might be the last very attempt we can have at this objective, is possible. So the EU, I trust, will be able to speak with more unanimity and with a stronger voice if and once the conditions with respect to our partners, including in Washington, become more conducive. But of course, this is just my hope, but it's difficult to say. And of course, on the other side, it depends also on the political elite and nomenclatura and partners on the Israeli side. As you, I don't know to what extent you follow this there, but there is a clear majority in the Knesset and in the current coalition government, which supports the continuation of de facto annexation or expansion of illegal settlements, as we see it. There is a clear majority, right? So it's difficult to say, listen, you need two for tango, but we can say that we continue working with all parties on the basis of the internationally agreed parameters, on the basis of the Oslo Agreement signed between Israel and Palestine, and on the basis of the European Council conclusions, which are very clear about this. So that to Ibrahim. The second question, EU NGOs, what are the kind of partnerships the EU NGOs can imagine with CSOs in Palestine? Well, I mean, if it wasn't for the European NGOs and funding through us, we wouldn't be where we are. I mean, the CSOs in Palestine are to a large extent supported by the European Union and its member states to a very large extent. There was a recent spat regarding restrictive clauses, which basically formalized established regulations at the EU level concerning avoiding or not being able to channel funds to entities on the restrictive lists. There are 6 Palestinian militant factions which are on the restrictive list and which cannot receive funds, and that led to a spat between Palestinian NGOs and the European Union at large. It was also discussed in the European Parliament, and we undertook a very sort of comprehensive safeguard review to ensure that no funding can actually go to terrorist entities or those on the restrictive lists. But I think it's very important for the European NGOs and the Palestinian civil society to continue working closely together, because it's the only way forward where you can provide for a more vibrant civil society, where you can encourage a culture of tolerance both in Gaza and in the West Bank, and where you can also support communities, as Danya said, through local government and governance activities, where I think this is also important. So I trust we have, and I personally have a very good relationship with NGOs operating in Palestine, both international and locals. Gaza is more complicated because of access and also of a different governance system. Hamas has a different political animal than the PA in the West Bank. The question of Anya concerning higher education support. Yes, we have, of course, through Erasmus Plus, facilities for universities, notably students, but also teachers, professors, and I'm not sure, I know whether your university also has these, has explored these facilities, but I know that we have regular Palestinian participants who are there. If need be or so wished, please send me your email, and I will try with my office to reply in a more comprehensive fashion to all the facilities one can imagine in order to provide for higher education support. Yes, I am sure the organizers will kindly forward my email to you, and then I can respond beyond Erasmus Plus, which we have. And then last but not least, the sanctions list. This is a list of 1,600 lists, and this is not given by the Israeli authorities. It includes, of course, Israeli authority lists, but it is worldwide. You know, it concerns Afghanistan and Syria and the US and everything in Europe. So this is basically the compendium of every single sanction list. and it applies worldwide, right? So if we basically use a software to screen the recipient of direct funds through budget support, be they cash transfer recipients or salary or pension recipients, and I can assure you that not a single recipient ever has been on any of the lists. As a matter of fact, just to conclude on that matter, we have 6 Palestinian entities, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, etc., on the restrictive list. Not a single Palestinian is as an individual on that list as well, just for you to know. So it's clear that we have to also, towards the European Union taxpayers and towards the European Union Parliament, ensure that we actually do our utmost to avoid that funds directly or indirectly are channeled to entities on the restrictive list. This list, by the way, is updated regularly by the European Council. This is not a measure where I have any impact or any other individual. This is a process which is regularly updated. And of course, by the way, NGOs and governments can impact on this revision process, right? So if, for instance, a Palestinian or Syrian or Libyan or Afghani operators feel and agents feel this is not fair or just, they can, of course, use their best offices to try to influence the revisiting of these lists. Okay, I hope I answered these 4 questions to your satisfaction.
Thank you very much, Sven. I think this was a very good answer, and thanks for clarifying also on the different lists. That was important, I think. I get a question for Danya, maybe Karim, very briefly, your question. Karim Thabit. Karim, can you hear us? Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead with your question. Or if it doesn't work, seems to be difficult to work, and then I'll read out the question really quickly. It's a question to Danya and he basically asks to solve the dilemma of to not support the current government. What would be about a model of establishing a so-called social fund for development, like in the case of Yemen or Egypt? And last but not least, I think we have a question from Matthias. Would you be available? Matthias Dalik.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Yeah, so Matthias Dalik, I work at DG DevCo at the European Commission, but here as a private citizen, so to speak, since we don't really deal with MENA. I was wondering, I don't know if Sven has disconnected or not, because I can't see him anymore, but I was wondering, since the Western diplomacy in general has a bit of a mixed record in relying overly on authoritarian strongmen and then sort of being surprised that they don't last forever, and also considering everything that has been said before on the difficulties of supporting governments. I was wondering if there's if you have ideas or if you know things are going how European diplomacy and maybe the EU in particular could improve the way that they engage or consider in their planning, in their policy, social movements such as the so-called October Revolution in Lebanon or other social movements in the region.
Great, thank you very much. I think due to the time constraints, I now give back to the panel. Maybe you first, Danya.
Yeah, I'll go into the 2 questions very briefly about having social fund for development. That's yes, but the point is how can you have to make sure the delivery again, all the problem is with the delivery. How is the delivery? I'm not sure. I don't know how was the delivery in Yemen or in Egypt. I can't tell you how was the delivery of those project. But one thing for sure, I mean, I know that the World Bank, for example, with Lebanon, has a project for a social safety net because the government doesn't offer it. So here, yes, international financial institution and international donor can offer this social safety net because the government doesn't offer it. Another thing, about what the EU can do, because they one of the things I would like to mention, that they can also engage with the private sector, because we have rentier economy. So if the EU engages with the private sector, in the sense encourage the small and medium businesses, that will also deliver change, that you'll have prosperous economies. And it can be like, it doesn't have to be something costly, it's just, if you offer tax breaks for European company who produce in countries like Egypt, like Lebanon, that will be of great help. So they can use policy to promote the private sector. I'll stop at that because we're running out of time.
Thank you very much, Dania. Maybe Sven, on the last question, very briefly.
Yes, yes, to my colleague, to my German colleague in DEFCO. Yes, I think a key request to the EAS would be to ensure your local intelligence and your capacities on the ground to be able to engage proactively with social movements or currents, which then could lead to important triggers and catalysts for societal change or for requests towards the authorities. Very often we are too late. We are surprised. We were surprised by the Arab Spring. And it's important. I can tell you that at least my office here in Palestine is composed of a number of political analysts. I'm really doté with a very good sort of outfit. But I tell you also very honestly that I don't know much about Gaza, because I can't be there regularly, and I only rely on third parties because of our inability to engage directly with a number of important actors there. So the EU has to reconsider its ability to be able to act preemptively and preventively. And for that, it needs to step up its intelligence capacities and network better with other actors. This is also important in order to ensure that we can become more effective in conflict resolution and peace mediation. We have a peace mediation team, for instance, in Brussels, which is completely, and I couldn't say Chatham rules because this is public, but I think we can do much more in terms of boosting their capacities and making them proactively engaging into certain conflicts, right? So where is then the call in Nagorno-Karabakh right now for the EU mediator, right? Where is the call for a conflict between Chad and southern Libya for an EU mediator? Where is the call for an EU active involvement in the Boko Haram conflict? And I could name you hundreds of conflicts where the EU is not 100% or not sufficiently or not at all involved, and where I think we could play this very important role as an honest broker, not as someone who has vested interest and who wants back to empower and impose its view on a given situation. And I think there is something where we can do much more and much better on that front, including, of course, acting with the social movements when the moment is right.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we forgot to launch the poll. Maybe Dalia, if you want to just put it out there very quickly. I think in the first poll that we had, most people had a maybe as the answer. I think 70% voted for, yeah, we will maybe see results. Now, of course, we have it's a smaller number just to get a quick picture of what if anything changed in the perceptions. I see a bit of a stronger yes side maybe, but in any case, thank you very much for the very interesting and relevant questions that we got today from the audience. And a big thank you for our two panelists who had to play the role of three panelists, but I think you filled this extremely well. And I think we had very interesting inputs from both of you. That's from my side. Dalia, I think you can now can you show the results? I think we still have the majority saying maybe yes. And the overall picture didn't really change after the debate. I feel maybe a bit of more people that say yes, it is obvious that EU and MENA governments will need to work much closer following the pandemic. Quickly back to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Yeah, I think maybe is better than no, of course. So I'm glad to see that the Euro MENA filia that I have is also shared in that sense. Yeah, I mean, I would also like to thank Dania and Sven very, very much for taking part today. I think you both provided some fascinating general points on some of these bigger questions around geopolitics and what have you, but also some really, really interesting insights into the two countries that you know the best in the region, Lebanon and Palestine. I think there was really a lot there, and I certainly learned a lot listening to both of you, and also to the questions as well. Thank you very much to the participants in today's debate, for the questions, for the engagement. Also for the engagement right throughout this this online debate series, which we've now had four episodes of. Thank you also very much to my colleagues at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for the co-organisation of this. And yeah, I think this is certainly a conversation that we will continue to have over the next months and years. So thank you very much from the perspective of the German Development Institute and from myself personally. And one perhaps last thing just on Sven, on Ibrahim, sorry. I've known Ibrahim for a very, very long time. It's a great pity that he wasn't able to take part today, and I just hope that that everything's okay with him.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.